The night the factory burned and my best friend died, the girl I loved vanished without a word. 41 years later, a stranger called me Dad, handed me a cassette tape that proved her father had broken us up, and gave me back a ring I'd made from a factory bolt. That ring cleared a dead man's name, brought me a granddaughter I didn't know I had, and sat heavy in my pocket when I finally stood over my first love's grave and told her I never stopped. Hey folks, it's your gray-bearded neighbor Jack, and you're watching Mind-Blowing Stories. Before we dive in, I have to say it plain. 96% of you who watch these videos aren't subscribed. That stings a little. Feels like telling my best story to a room where most folks leave before the punchline. Do me a kindness, tap subscribe, give this a like, and drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've had a love you never quite got over. I read them all. All right, settle in. This one starts in Ohio in the 70s with a girl named Emily Rhodes, a factory called Whitaker Tool Die, and a fire that changed everything. I grew up in Dayton, Southside, 2-bedroom house with aluminum siding that sang in the rain. My dad worked nights at the GM plant. My mom did double shifts at Kettering Medical. We ate what was on sale: canned peaches, chipped beef, fried bologna. I learned early to love the sound of a V8 and the quiet of an empty morning when you come home from a night shift and the birds don't know enough to hush. I met Emily in '77 at the Yellow Springs Street Fair, of all places. Yellow Springs was different. Tie-dye, bookstores, folks playing guitar on the sidewalk like money was something that grew back on trees. I was 19, full of grease and pride. She was 17, going on old soul. Brown hair to her shoulders, a tiny chip in one front tooth. She wore a denim jacket with tiny embroidered flowers up near the collarbones, like constellations only she knew by heart. She was holding a book in one hand and a lemonade in the other, and I almost ran my Chevy Nova into a mailbox trying to park because of how she laughed when her drink fizzed too high. She was from a different world. Her dad, Professor Arthur Rhodes, taught political theory at the college. Her mother hosted these evenings where everyone drank wine that tasted like mouthwash and argued the meaning of art. I went to one. I put on my one-collared shirt and borrowed a belt that didn't have my name stamped in the leather. I stood by the bookshelf and tried to look like I understood anything. I didn't. But I understood Emily. The way she chewed the inside of her lip when she was thinking. The way she scribbled in the margins of every book she touched. The way she loved old soul records and could fix a bulky turntable with a bobby pin and a breath. She wasn't stuck up about any of it. She loved that I could change her oil. She said my hands looked like I'd earned them. We'd sit in the Nova, seats hot from the sun, dashboards full of pennies for tolls, and we'd talk about the life we were going to build. She wanted Nashville. She sang like Emmylou when she was alone, and like herself when she was with me, which I thought was the real miracle. I don't know. I wanted off the line, out of the noise. I wanted a house with a porch. I wanted to be the kind of man you could leave your heart with and expect it back in better shape than you gave it. We were kids, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like we'd been walking toward each other since childhood and had finally met halfway. There was one person who didn't see it our way. Professor Rhodes. I'll call him Arthur because that's what everyone else did. He didn't shout or swear. He was polite to me in a way that made me feel like a stray dog someone had decided to tolerate. He'd ask me questions with the same face he used for the evening news. And if you've ever had a man take your measure with a poured, concrete smile, you know what I mean. He asked me about plans. I said Nashville. He asked me about money. I said I had some. He asked me about backup plans. I said love. He winced like I'd offered him a raw onion. Emily would squeeze my hand under the table. We'd escape after dinner, and she'd whisper that we'd prove him wrong, that once he saw how serious we were, he'd have to come around. I didn't say the thing I thought, which was that some men would rather be wrong forever than admit it in public. We were saving. Every spare dollar went into a Folgers coffee can under the back seat. I was doing overtime at Whitaker Tool Dye, where I'd started sweeping floors right out of high school and worked my way up to operating a punch press. It was hard and loud, and the metal dust stuck to your sweat like glitter at a county fair, but the pay wasn't bad. My best friend there was a guy named Miguel Alvarez, but everyone called him Mickey. He was 5 years older, had a laugh big enough to bounce off the rafters and land back in your lap, and called everyone hermano whether you deserved it or not. He was the kind of friend who'd show up with jumper cables before you finished saying hello. He loved the Reds, and he loved his mama, and he loved to get into just enough trouble to feel young. On our lunch breaks, Mickey and I would sit on upturned milk crates by the loading dock, eat ham sandwiches, and talk about Nashville like it was the moon, and we already had our tickets. He told me I was crazy, and then added that he had my back anyway. He didn't know what he wanted, not really, except to make enough to get his mom out of the little rental behind the laundromat, and to find a woman who'd argue with him in the mornings and kiss him quiet at night. Now, if you're paying attention, you're waiting for the turn. You know there's a reason I started with a fire. I'll get there. But I have to tell you about the ring first. I didn't have money for diamonds. I barely had money for gas. But I had metal, and I had hands that knew what to do with it. On a slow Tuesday, after my shift, I stayed late with the blessing of our foreman, a man named Dale Kincaid, who pretended not to notice when we bent the rules if it was for romance. I took a spare bolt steel, solid, smooth, and I cut it, heated it, hammered it around a mandrel until it was a circle, then ground it down until it wore the scars like a story. I stamped the inside with 2 letters and a symbol E, plus sign, J, because subtlety wasn't my talent. I wrapped it in a square of my old t-shirt and put it in my pocket, and walked around for 2 weeks, feeling like a man with a pocket full of gasoline and a matchbox of reasons. I proposed at John Bryan State Park on a little footbridge over the river. It was late afternoon, the light all gold and smeary, and a couple of teens were carving initials into the rail like they'd invented love. I didn't get on one knee because my legs were shaking enough upright, and because I'd seen too many TV proposals that looked like commercials for expensive soap. I just held out the ring in my palm and said, "I want to wake up old with you, Em. I want your coffee to be the first smell of my day. I want your hair clogging my drain, and your handwriting on every grocery list I ever write. I want the fights, and the makeups, and the whole sparkling mess." She cried her soft cry, the one where she tried to hide her face in my shoulder, and said yes. She said yes like it was a secret only we could hear. We set a date for leaving. Not a wedding date, not yet. A leaving date, which felt just as ceremonial. August 18th, 1979. A Saturday. We'd drive to Nashville, find a cheap place, I'd pick up whatever work I could, she'd audition where she could, and we'd call my parents from a payphone and hers from a safer distance. We'd make it right later, we told ourselves. We'd prove ourselves, and then come home, righteous. God loves fools and children, someone said, and we were both. I tuned up the Nova. Emily packed a duffel with more books than clothing. Mickey gave me a Swiss Army knife and a stack of advice we didn't need. The Friday night before we were supposed to go, there was an explosion at Whitaker. Not a huge one at first, just enough to rattle everyone's teeth and send the night shift running. We got the call around 9. If you've never watched a place you've bled in Catchfire, let me tell you what it does. It's like watching someone break your grandfather's watch with a hammer. You know it's just a thing, and you know it's not, and your heart can't figure out which to choose. I drove fast, radio off, windows down, that metallic burning stench already in the air like rust in a storm. By the time I got there, flames licked through the broken windows and the brick was sweating. The volunteer fire department did what they could. Men I knew were dragging hoses across a lot I'd parked in 1,000 times. Someone shouted that Mickey was inside. He'd gone in to check the locker room, or the electrical, or because he was Mickey, and if there was a dangerous thing available, he had to go shake hands with it. I don't remember deciding to go after him. I just remember that the door was hot, and that my forearm hair crisped, and that the smoke tasted like nails. I found him near Bay 3, coughing and swearing and dragging someone else, a kid from intake who hadn't found the exit fast enough. We got the kid out, and then the roof did something that roofs do when they're tired of pretending. It sighed and dropped 20 feet of ceiling like a bookcase falling sideways. Mickey shoved me toward the door and shouted, "Go, Jack, go!" I went. He didn't make it. The next morning, the paper said the fire was likely electrical. Folks in town said a lot of other things. You need to know something about Whitaker. It wasn't just a job. It was pride. It was baseball teams and church picnics and the reason anyone on my street owned a second car. Tom Whitaker, the owner, had a mustache that felt like a man being brave about his hairline, and a way of making a speech that could convince a crowd to clap itself silly about things that were going to cost them. He liked to play the part of benevolent father, but he made money like any man in a suit by keeping hours. He'd had trouble that year, contracts falling through, insurance payments late. If you were the kind of person who thought you saw patterns everywhere, you could have drawn a line through all that, and a fire. I went home that morning with my hair smelling like a campfire, and my chest aching for air, and lay on my back on the floor, because the bed felt like a lie. The phone rang and I screamed when it did, because I thought it was going to be Emily calling to say, "Let's go now. Let's outrun grief." But it wasn't. It was the foreman Dale. He said the investigators might want to talk to me because I'd stayed late a few times, and because maybe someone had said something about me in the ring, and there'd been stupid talk, of a blowtorch left on in my corner. I said, "I turned it off." He said, "I know you did." I said, "Mickey's dead." He said, "I know he is, son." He called me son, and I cried like a small one. I tried calling Emily. No answer. I left a message with her mother. I started pacing. I took the ring out of my pocket and rubbed it like a worry stone. I made a sandwich and didn't eat it. I thought about calling my mom, but if I heard her voice, I was going to fold in half and not get up. Around noon, a patrol car pulled up. 2 officers asked me to come down and talk, I went. In a room that smelled like coffee grinds and pencil shavings, a thin man with a tie like a bad birthday present asked me questions that were almost polite. Had I ever seen anyone propping doors with bricks? Had I ever noticed the breaker panel being hot? Had I ever stayed late after the foreman left? Did I have any reason to be angry with Whitaker? He asked the last one like he really wanted me to say yes. I said I stayed late to make a ring. He looked at me like I'd told him I'd been practicing witchcraft. He asked to see it. I lied and said I didn't have it with me. He asked if I owned any lighter fluid beyond what a man needs for a grill. I wanted to say that what a man needs and what a man has are not the same category, but I just said, "No, sir." After a couple of hours of this polite accusation, they let me go. On my porch, there was an envelope, no stamp, my name in blue ink on the front, the good pen kind. Inside was a folded piece of paper and my ring. My ring. The 2 letters and the plus sign staring up at me like a face. The note was short. "Jack, I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. My father was right. Don't call. I need you to move on." I read it once with my eyes and again with my bones. I held the ring and I waited for it to tell me there'd been a mistake. I looked up the street, half expecting Emily to turn the corner, hair flying, face flushed, shouting that she was sorry, that she'd been scared, that she'd made a terrible error. Nothing. The envelope smelled like her mother's house sage tea and lemons. I sat on the steps until the sun slid behind the trees, and the mosquitoes knew what to do with a man who didn't know how to go inside. The next morning I went to the Rhodes house. Arthur opened the door with a face I couldn't read. He said Emily wasn't there. He said she'd gone to stay with an aunt in Cincinnati to think things over. He said, in that voice of his, that it was best if I respected her wishes. I asked to talk to her mother. He said she was resting. I asked if I could write Emily. He said he'd make sure any letters were returned unopened. I said, "She loves me." He said, "You're young." I said, "She loves me." He said, "Love is not a plan." He closed the door like he was pinching the wick on a candle. So that's how things ended. That's how my first love story was shut in a drawer. I went home, packed the Nova, and didn't go to Nashville. I went nowhere. I drove for a few hours on 35 with the radio off, and then I parked at a rest stop and cried in the driver's seat with my forehead on the wheel. 2 days later, I called Whitaker and told them I needed time. 2 weeks later, I went back because bills don't pause for grief. The fire was still under investigation. People looked at me like an empty gas can. A few of them were kind enough to look away. The months that followed were a kind of winter, even though the leaves were still green. Mickey's funeral was a crush of bodies and speeches and no good answers. His mama held my face and told me he loved me like a brother. I said I should have dragged him out. She said it wasn't mine to carry. I carried it anyway. The investigators concluded what they always do when there are more questions than money. Accident. The end. Tom Whitaker gave a speech about resilience. People clapped because that's what you do when a man in a suit stops talking and looks at you. I saw Emily once that fall, across a street in downtown Dayton. She was with her mother, carrying a brown paper bag from the pharmacy. Her hair was shorter. She had glasses I'd never seen. She looked smaller, like someone had washed her sweater in hot water, and it had shrunk with her in it. She lifted her head and saw me and did a thing with her mouth that wasn't a smile. It was more like a message, please don't. So I didn't. I let her walk away. I cannot explain to you how proud I was of that act of inaction. It felt like jumping in front of a train. I went home and picked up the ring and put it in a shoebox with the concert stubs and a photo of us where she's blowing out a candle, and I'm looking at her like a man looks at the last warm thing in a cold room. Life went on. It's rude that it does. I worked. My parents grew older. I dated a woman named Karen from the hospital where my mom worked. She was kind, smarter than me by a yard and a half, liked crossword puzzles and laughed with her whole face. We married when I was 24, and we did our best for 8 years. Love is not a plan, Arthur had said, and it turned out he was right about that part, though not for the reasons he wanted. Karen wanted children. We tried. Life said not for you. We drifted. We divorced gentle, like people who wanted to leave each other better than they found each other. She remarried, had 2 daughters by a man who coached their soccer teams, and wrote her notes on Post-its that said things like, "You're the good in my day." I kept working. Then I took a job with the power company, became a lineman, started climbing poles and restoring folks' lights after storms. It felt like a kind of penance and a kind of miracle. I learned the patience of bad weather and the kindness of neighbors who bring you coffee at 2 a.m. I saved up. I fixed up a little house that had been waiting for someone to love it. My parents died, 10 years apart. I learned to make carrot cake the way my mother did. I learned to say the names of my griefs out loud in an empty kitchen and have that be enough company to get me through a night. And then I got old. Or older. That's the funny thing. There's no announcement. One day you bend to tie your shoe and make a sound. You stand in a hardware store and get teary-eyed about how nice the screws look in their little bins. I retired at 63, to more applause than I deserved. The company gave me a plaque that would have made my father crack a smile. I moved out west because I'd always wanted to see the sky do that thing over the mountains. I ended up in Bend, Oregon. I fished. I made friends with a neighbor who talked too much about trout. And then, because my hands got restless and my words did too, I started this little channel, Mind-Blowing Stories. I figured I had enough of them stored up. A man's life is a junk drawer of tales if he lives it with his eyes open. 3 summers ago, on a Tuesday, the phone rang. I was in the garage, sanding an old chair I'd found at a yard sale, turning it from ugly to honest. The number was unfamiliar and out of state. I would have let it go to voicemail if it wasn't for the hour. You get to my age and you answer phones at odd times because you know the odds. The voice was a woman's, a little breathless, like she'd run up a flight of stairs. "Hi. This is going to sound crazy." "Are you Jack Miller?" I said I was. She said, "Did you grow up in Dayton? Did you work at Whittaker Tool Dye? Did you, know an Emily Rhodes?" I sat down on the back step without deciding to. I said, "Yes." The voice did a soft little shiver. "My name is Lucy Harper. I think I'm your daughter." There are moments when your life is the same and not, when a word rearranges the furniture in every memory you've got. I have been hit by a downed limb in a storm. It feels like that. I asked her to say that again, because my ears didn't trust my heart. She did. I asked her if she was sure. She said she had done one of those DNA kits a year ago. for fun, and a name had popped up that matched someone in my family tree. She had questions. She'd hired someone who knew how to look into the past without leaving footprints. She had a birth certificate with her birthday in the right year and no father listed. She had a letter, sealed for 40 years and not meant for her, written by an Emily Rhodes and addressed to a Jack Miller who had moved and didn't leave a forwarding address. She had a shoebox. She had a tape. I asked her to hold on. I put the phone on the little table by the back step and leaned my head on the siding and felt my chest do a thing like a skipped gear. Then I picked the phone back up and said, "Where are you?" She said she was in Portland. She said she could drive. I said, "I'll make coffee." She said she didn't drink coffee. I said I'd try to love her anyway. She laughed just like Emily. I closed my eyes and the years between then and now slid together like two hands. She showed up that afternoon in a car that had crumbs in the cup holder and a baby seat in the back, the kind of lived-in that tells you a person's real. She was 39, with Emily's eyes and my stubborn jawline. She had a little boy asleep in the seat, cheeks flushed the way all sleeping kids do, like they've just come back from a run in their dreams. She stood on my porch, and I stood in my doorway, and we looked at each other like mirrors, and then we hugged in a way that started careful and ended with neither of us caring about careful at all. The little boy woke and looked at me like I was a new animal at the zoo. Her husband, she said, was parking. His name was Eric. He came up behind her with flowers he'd obviously bought at the last second, and a smile that said he didn't know what to do and was going to do it anyway. I liked him right away. We sat at the kitchen table, and she told me the story that had happened while mine was happening somewhere else. Emily had been pregnant when she disappeared. She had tried to tell me, she said. She had written me a letter, and then another, and had called twice from a payphone outside a laundromat and hung up both times when a woman answered. The woman had been my mother, and the timing had been cruel. She was on nights and sleeping like something that had been unplugged. Emily had gotten sick one morning. Her mother had found her. Arthur had made decisions. He had put Emily on a bus to Cincinnati under the pretense of visiting an aunt, then on another to Columbus, then to a home for unwed mothers where the address was not given to the girls until they left. The rules there were firm and pretending to be kind. The baby would be adopted by a nice family and everyone would be saved from something. Emily had been there 2 months before she ran away back to Dayton. She came home to find that I had moved, that her father had an answer ready for every question, that her ring had been returned to me with a note he dictated. When she asked if she could cross town to find me, he told her she could, but that before she did, he wanted to show her something. He showed her a folder, photos of a fire. Affidavits neatly arranged like a deck of cards. Notes from someone who said I had made comments about quitting, about making a statement. A statement. He said he was protecting her from a man in trouble. He said he was protecting a child from a father who might be in prison by Christmas. He said a lot of things in a voice that sounded like the evening news when it's sure. She had known he was manipulating her, but she had been exhausted and broken in body and scared and 18, and the man wearing the nice sweater was her father. She folded. The baby was born in late spring of 1980. A girl. Emily held her for an hour because that was what they allowed, and then the baby was taken. She had named her Lucy in her heart. Somehow, through a set of coincidences that sounded like the hand of a wiser person than me, Lucy ended up adopted by a librarian named Harper, who lived 2 towns over from Yellow Springs. Emily found a job in a bookstore, moved to Oregon with a friend 2 years later because it hurt less if there was distance, and married a park ranger named Sam, who adored her like it was his job. They tried for children and didn't have any. She sang in a bar on Thursdays. She kept the shoebox in her closet like a memory palace, and never told Sam everything because she didn't know how to tell him without breaking something they'd built. Years later, when the world made it possible for everyone to spit in a tube and see who they were related to, Lucy had done that. She had grown up loved and curious. Her adoptive mother had told her on her 18th birthday that she'd come from a good girl who had made a hard choice. Lucy, being Lucy, had made peace with that information, and then got busy. She found Emily because Emily had, in those last years, posted a few photos on the internet like a breadcrumb trail. She found me by the unglamorous combination of public records and people who are good at using them. She called Emily first. Emily didn't answer. Emily didn't answer because she was in hospice. Ovarian cancer. She had fought like a person who'd already survived other things. She was tired. She had written a letter to me, dated a few months earlier, that she hadn't mailed because she didn't know where in the wide country I was. It was in the shoebox, with the ring and a cassette tape labeled in her careful hand. Arthur and Tom, 1980. We opened the shoebox together at my kitchen table. The ring was there, wrapped in the same soft square of t-shirt. It had more weight than it had when I'd made it. The letter was folded once. I didn't open it yet. The tape. The tape made my hands shake. I don't know why she had recorded it. Maybe she had suspected there would be a moment when she would need proof in the way a woman walking alone at night keeps her keys pointed outward in her fist. Maybe she had set a recorder on a shelf and left a room, and come back and picked it up. Maybe she had been in the hall. The sounds were muffled and clear at the same time in the way that sounds are when they carry a truth they didn't know they were carrying. I had an old tape deck in the garage. I used to record late-night radio shows when I couldn't sleep. We threaded the cassette. Lucy's boy, Owen, banged a spoon on the table in approval, because that's what toddlers do with any technology older than they are. We pressed play. At first, just the clink of ice in a glass. A voice like a suit, Tom Whitaker. Another voice like a sweater. Arthur. Tom said, the policy paid out. Arthur said, I told you it would if we made it clear enough on paper that the wiring was old. Tom said, I appreciate your, assistance. Arthur said, we're not talking about this again. Tom said, I'll keep your daughter out of it if you keep my name clean. Arthur said, my daughter's going to make good choices if I have to make them for her. Tom laughed. And then a third sound, the one that made my stomach fold. Mickey's name, spoken like a footnote. Tom said, no one cares. He didn't have a family. Arthur said, you're fortunate. And then the tape clicked because one of them had tapped the table too hard. I stopped the tape. We just sat there with the sound of my refrigerator humming and the quiet of a house that had never learned to expect this. Lucy looked like someone had reached inside her chest and reordered the furniture. She said, so. I said, so. Owen said, spoon. I hadn't felt rage in a long time. I had felt irritation at traffic and annoyance at price tags and fury at the way the world eats young men whole. But this was a different thing. This was heat under ice. I picked up the ring. It was warm from my palm. I said, "We're going to make this matter." Lucy said, "How?" I said, "I don't know yet. But I know people who know how to make old noise into new truth." We started with a reporter. Her name was Donna Keene. She'd done a piece on a series of arsons in the 80s when the mills were going belly up, and was one of those people who, when she decides she's going to chew on a bone, you can set your clock by it. She met us at a diner where the coffee tasted like it had been brewed during the Ford administration, and she put a little recorder on the table as if to announce that nothing said in that booth was ever going to die. We played the tape. She listened with her mouth set the way people set their mouths when they're doing math on a deadline. She said we couldn't use the tape as is for 1,000 reasons that have to do with consent and hearsay and all those legal words that make my eye twitch. But she said the tape was a map. It told her where to dig. It told her who to ask and how to ask it. She'd find someone who had sat on a similar truth for 40 years and was tired of it. "You'd be amazed," she said, "how many secrets get heavy around retirement. The digging took weeks. You'll think I'm skipping the boring parts because I'm trying to make this a story with guts, but honestly, those weeks mattered. Lucy and I became something like family. We went to the park. We cooked. She told me about her childhood, about the librarian who stacked Christmas presents on the sofa and cried on adoption anniversaries. I told her about Mickey teaching me how to dance at a wedding by putting my feet on top of his and moving me like a potted fern. We learned each other the way families do, by accident and repeated exposure. Sam, Emily's husband, called. He had found my number on a wrinkled sheet of paper at the bottom of the shoebox after Lucy had taken the first layer. He said, "Jack, I think I'm supposed to talk to you." His voice was kind. He sounded like the sort of man who knows how to coax a cat out from under a porch. He told me about Emily's last months, about how she had talked to the window when she couldn't sleep, about how she had said my name in the sound a person makes when they are not asking for anything anymore. He told me she had left him a letter, too, telling him she had loved him in the way you love the person who shows up with soup and patience. He said he had enough in him to know he was lucky. He said, "I want to meet you." I said, "I'd like that." When we hung up, I cried in the garage with the sawdust sticking to my face like maybe I'd been making something instead. Donna called one morning like she was running from something and the phone was the finish line. She had found a retired insurance adjuster in Cincinnati. He had been the one to sign off on the Whitaker claim. He had notes. He had been troubled then, and had made a notation consultant AR assures compliance. Consultant AR, not Tom Whitaker. Not Dale. Arthur Rhodes. The man who made sentences sound like verdicts. The adjuster was ready to talk because he had nothing to lose, and a grandson who had just been born, and a need to not be a man who kept bad truths to himself. We flew to Ohio. I hadn't been back in too long. The airport smelled the same, like pretzels and wishful thinking. We rented a car and drove past the place where the Nova had overheated on prom night, and the parking lot where I had kissed a girl who wasn't Emily and felt afterward like I'd eaten a piece of bread when there was steak at home. The Whitaker building was something else now. An indoor trampoline park for children whose parents needed an hour of not being clung to. The lot was the same, though. I stood in it, and I could smell smoke like a memory you try not to wear. The adjuster, Mr. Crowley, lived in a beige condo with a plastic wreath on the door. He had a voice like the whine of a screen door and hands that shook a little when he poured coffee. He told us what he knew. He said Tom Whitaker had been in trouble. He said an investigation had shown wiring so old it should have been arrested. He said a consultant had filed supplemental paperwork after the fact that had, in the way those things do, turned questions into commas. He said he had been young and not looking to make enemies with men who belonged to the same golf club as his boss. He said he had written down the initials because he was the kind of man who wrote everything down when he was scared. He said he had always thought someone should ask questions about that kid. Who died? Mickey. He said the name like he was trying it on for the first time. The paper printed Donna's story a month later. The headline was the kind that editors write when they're trying to make up for 4 decades of silence. It said something like, "New evidence sheds doubt on 1980 factory fire ruling." There were names. There were quotes from Mr. Crowley. There was confidentiality around others until they were sure the legal weather would hold. There was a small column of remembrance about Mickey that made me cry into my scrambled eggs because it was the first time anyone had written about him like he'd been more than a footnote. The city council made noises about forming a citizens' review board to look into everything and nothing. Tom Whitaker was gone. Had died a few years earlier with his mustache bravely intact. Arthur was still alive, tucked in at a facility that smelled like all such places do, clean and tired. He had dementia, they said, the kind that steals nouns first and mercy later. I didn't want to see him, and I had to. Lucy said she'd go with me. She said she wanted to see the man who had been in the tape, and then she laughed because she knew how that sounded. People are not their worst choices alone. People are not just anything alone. But sometimes you need to look them in the face anyway. He was smaller. He was wearing a cardigan, of course. He was staring at a TV without seeing it. A nurse introduced me as Jack, an old friend of the family. He blinked like my name was a light being turned on and off. I sat. I told him my name again. He looked at my hands. He said, "Rings are for promises." I said, "I made your daughter one." He nodded, and then his eyes slid away, the way they do when the train leaves the station and leaves you on the bench. He said, the boy, with the laugh. I said, "Mickey." He said, "That was wrong. I've told someone that, haven't I?" I said, "Not yet." He nodded, tiny, like conceding a point. He said, "I told myself I was protecting her." I said, "You were protecting yourself." He said, "Well." And then he said, "I liked you." That was the worst of it. Maybe. That he had liked me enough to be kind while he was being cruel. I don't know what forgiveness is supposed to look like. Churches have ideas. So do therapists. I only had the chair I was sitting in, and the man in front of me, and the knowledge that he was far, far away from both of us. I said, "I forgive you." I did not forgive him because he'd asked, or because he deserved it. I forgave him because the anger was killing me faster than my years were. He nodded like I'd told him something about the weather. I left and I shook in the parking lot, and Lucy held my shoulders like she was keeping me inside my own skin. We visited a cemetery that afternoon. I hadn't planned on it, but these things call you with a quiet voice, and you either listen or you carry that quiet around too long. Mickey's mother had been gone 10 years, but she had a stone right beside his, like she'd planned their last shared address. I sat there and told him the story, the whole of it, as if he hadn't been present for the worst parts. I told him about the tape. I told him about Lucy. I told him about the ring. I told him about saving a 2-year-old from a backyard pool the week before, because Owen had wandered off and gone silent in the way toddlers do, and I had found him face down and done what Mickey had taught me in a break room once, years ago, while we were laughing and he was showing me how to press and breathe. Press and breathe. Owen coughed and cried and hated me for a full minute and then clung like I had invented arms. I told Mickey that some things make a circle if you wait long enough. We drove back to Oregon, like people drive when they're bringing something home. On the way, we stopped in a small town in Nebraska because Owen needed a playground, and we needed to not think for a minute. There was a little store next to the park. A woman behind the counter watched us buy water and crackers and then said, "Are you Jack Miller?" Not like a fan, not like a viewer, like someone who had seen me once, long ago, and had been waiting to confirm it. I said yes. She said, "I used to sit behind you in 9th grade English. I was the one with the cough. You used to pass me notes that said, 'Drink water,' in all caps." I laughed in a way that hurt. She said, "You were a good one." I said, "I try to be." She said, "Keep trying." It was small and it was everything. Back home we had a little gathering in my backyard. Lucy and Eric and Owen and Sam flew in, and Donna came because she had started to feel like family too. We ate ribs and potato salad and the kind of watermelon that makes you eat with your face. We told stories about Emily. Sam told one about how she used to sing to spiders before moving them outside, as if asking their permission to carry them in a glass. Lucy told one about how she had found a photo of me in Emily's shoebox with a note on the back in Emily's hand. "This is the boy I owe my life twofold." She had spelled two wrong and corrected it underneath, which made Lucy cry in that laughing way grief sometimes has. I told a story about the time Emily and I had gone to a drive-in and not watched a single minute of the movie because a thunderstorm had come through and we'd sat in the warm car in the cool rain and made plans so big there wasn't room in the front seat for them. Near the end of the night, when the mosquitoes were beginning their rude work and the citronella candles were claiming utter uselessness, Lucy took the ring from where it had been sitting on the table and said, "I think this should go here now," and she slid it onto a chain and put it around her neck. It hung beside a small locket with a photo of her adoptive mother and one of Emily. She said, "This is my map." She asked me to hold Owen. He was asleep within 30 seconds because some kids are built like that. Sleep is a switch. I felt his little heart beat rabbit fast against my chest and thought about the time I'd pressed on that chest and breathed for him because the world is an unkind teacher and sometimes gives you tests before it gives you lessons. Months passed. The town, in its slow way, admitted what it could. There was a ceremony at the community center. A city council member with a tie that had seen better days read a proclamation about regret. The words were fine. The faces were better. There were men my age who wouldn't meet my eyes because time hadn't made them less ashamed of their silence. And there were men who did meet my eyes because time had taught them that the only way across certain chasms is to walk forward, holding out both your hands. There was a framed statement about Mickey to be hung in the lobby of the trampoline park. It wasn't enough, and it was something. I went back to the cemetery after the ceremony and sat with Mickey again. because that's what you do when there's no one left to tell and you still need to tell it. I took the proclamation out of my pocket and read it aloud in my worst government voice. I told him he would have made a joke about how they spelled his last name wrong on the first draft, because of course they had. I told him I missed him like a missing tooth, the kind your tongue keeps finding. On the way back from the cemetery, I stopped at John Bryan State Park. I stood on that same footbridge 13 steps in from the Yellow Springs side because that's where I had been. The teens carving initials were different teens now, but somehow also the same. I held the rail. I thought about what vows are and what they cost. I thought about the secret ways we keep promises, even when the world keeps us from keeping them loud. I went home. I opened Emily's letter. Jack, it began, because she'd always started letters that way, even when the rest of the world was calling me John or Mr. Miller, or Hey You. I held this off as long as I could, because I am, to my own surprise, a coward when it comes to the things that might save me. If you are reading this, it's because Lucy found you, and if she found you, it's because I did not have the courage to try one more time while I was here, and I am asking for your mercy. I loved you in a way that made the underlines in my books make sense. My father did what he thought he had to. I made choices I don't know how to justify without asking you to be kinder than any person should be asked to be. I wanted you to know that when I wore the ring on a chain under my shirt the day I married Sam, it wasn't because I was uncertain. It was because I was telling the truth in two directions. I loved him. I loved you. He knew. And he loved me anyway. We did not have children, and I have tried to make peace with that. And then God surprised me in the last season of my life with Lucy at my door, and I have been a mother with borrowed time. If you meet her, if she lets you, tell her about your mother's carrot cake. Tell her about the time my hair got stuck in the car window and you had to drive 4 blocks with me leaning out like a flag because neither of us could figure out the crank. Tell her I sang to spiders. I closed the letter then because a person can only be alive so much in 1 hour. I smelled the paper because sometimes that's what people do when they want to keep someone longer. It smelled like the inside of a book in a store on a street where I had once been young. That was 2 years ago. Since then, life has continued at its plodding pace and with its sudden rips. Lucy and Eric live close. We have Sunday dinners where I overcook the chicken, and no one complains because the point is not the chicken. Owen is bigger and thinks I invented pancakes. We drive out to the river and throw rocks and act surprised every time they splash. Donna went on to do a podcast about old fires and new truths. She made me sound braver than I felt. Arthur died last fall, and Sam and I went to the service because if you don't go to things like that, you end up carrying around a debt you can't repay. We stood in the back and sang the one hymn everyone knows, even if you haven't been to church in 20 years. We didn't speak to anyone, and no one spoke to us. And somehow that felt like the kindest version of the day we were going to get. A week after the funeral, I got a package. No return address. Inside was a photo, black and white, of Emily at 17 sitting on the steps outside her father's building, chin on her knees, smiling at something someone had said off camera. On the back, in a careful hand that was not hers, a single line. She talked about you like you were a place. I put the photo on my fridge with a magnet shaped like a trout because you should keep your treasures where you can trip over them when you're looking for the milk. Sometimes at night, I sit in the garage with the door open and the cold creeping in until I can feel it in my ankles. I take the tape deck down off the shelf, and I hold it, but I don't play it. Some truths only need to be heard once. I take out the ring from wherever it is around Lucy's neck often, in my palm sometimes, and I turn it over and over like the wheel it is. People will ask me if I regret anything. That's like asking the river if it regrets the bend. We are where we are because of the shape of the land. But I will say this. If one old man's voice over the internet can save you from letting silence make your choices, let it be mine. Write the letter. Drive across town. Make the call. Knock on the door. Even if you think the person on the other side doesn't want to see you. Sometimes they don't, and that's a truth you can live with better than the question. I know some of you watch these videos because you like the twists. You want the moment where something turns into something else. Here it is, as plain as I can give it. The twist wasn't the tape, or the ring, or the headline. The twist was that love outlived everything that had been arranged to kill it. It outlived negligence, and pride, and time, and a girl's fear, and a boy's ignorance, and a father's need to be right. It showed up in a backyard pool when a man who learned CPR in a break room saved a boy who thinks pancakes are magic. It showed up in a park where a spider went free. It showed up at my kitchen table, which is an old thing I refinished, surrounded by people who were not mine, and then were. If you've made it this far, thank you for letting me put this out in the air. I swear stories change shape when you say them out loud. They get lighter, or you get stronger. And I'm going to end like I started, because some habits are good ones. If you felt something here, if this knocked loose a memory you want to keep, hit subscribe. It means more than you think. 96% of you watching are still not subscribed, which, to a man who tells his heart on camera, is enough to make me a little sad. Click the like button, drop a comment, tell me about your first love. Tell me if you ever found your way back to someone, or if you built something beautiful with someone new. That counts too. Share this with a friend who needs a nudge. You're watching Mind-Blowing Stories. I'm Jack. I'll see you next time. And if you're carrying a ring in your pocket right now, don't wait forever.